Yeah, I mean, who has time for this crap, right? A startup is a learning machine. The company itself is learning at a rate of knots, and the people in the company should be learning and growing at a rate of knots, right? And so what is their professional development program? Being part of a startup. It is the hardest, most interesting, most compelling, most exciting thing you can do in business, I believe. How are you going to help me with my professional development? Being part of this startup. Congratulations, Harry. Welcome aboard.
You're listening to the Startup Podcast. This is an educational episode, in-depth masterclasses about the concepts essential to building, running, and investing in Silicon Valley-style startups. Whether you're a founder, investor, or operator in a startup, you'll gain insights into the principles that power high-growth disruption the same way Facebook, Google, and Uber do it. The conversation starts now.
Hey, I'm Chris Saad.
And I'm Yaniv Bernstein. Today, we wanted to talk about something that may not be obvious to you as an early stage founder, but can really come back and bite you if you're not careful about it. And that is making sure your employees are happy with their career development and their career growth at your startup. There is really the situation that can happen as a founder where you let a bunch of people in and suddenly they're at you about their compensation, about their title, about their promotion, about all of these things, and none of it are you well equipped to deal with. So make sure that doesn't happen to you. Stay tuned, we'll tell you exactly how to get it right straight after the break. Whether you're starting or scaling your company's security program, demonstrating top-notch security practices and establishing trust is more important than ever. Vanta automates compliance for SOC 2, ISO 27001, and more, saving you time and money while helping you build customer trust. Plus, you can streamline security reviews by automating questionnaires and demonstrating your security posture with a customer-facing trust center, all powered by Vanta AI. And it gets even better. Just for TSP listeners, you can get $1,000 off Vanta when you go to vanta.com/TSP. That's VANTA.com/TSP for the Startup Podcast to get $1,000 off.
All right, Yaniv, before we jump into it, we wanted to tell everybody about the Startup Podcast Pact, which asks if you've been listening to a few of our episodes and getting lots of value, we only ask that you please subscribe to us in your favorite podcasting app, follow us on YouTube, and give us a shout out on your favorite social network. It helps us grow the show, get the very best guests, and help more founders like you. All right, with that, on with the show.
Chris, what I wanted to talk about today is career development for employees at early stage startups, because what I experienced as a founder and what I think is very common for founders is that they end up in this situation where they're kind of blindsided. So put yourself in the position of an early stage founder, or you are an early stage founder, Chris, and you have maybe raised a bit of money, you've put a lot of your heart and soul into the business, you've gotten to the position where you can hire your first few employees and you negotiate very hard on pay and equity. You try to give them a fair deal, but also cash is limited and so on. You get them on board and you're like, we're all focused on the mission. This thing, we need to get it to default alive. We need to build this incredible business together. And then what happens maybe 6 months down the track? The questions start coming from your employees. They say, how do I progress in my career here? What is the next step for me here at this startup? They say, I want a bigger title. When's the next salary review? And you're like, salary what? And they say, what are you doing for me to invest in my professional growth? I'll be honest, when that happened to me as a founder, is I was kind of blindsided because I was like, hey, we're just here to build the thing. But the truth is, and I think this is a really important bit of empathy as a founder, Chris, is your employees are in a fundamentally different position to the position that you're in as a founder. And you need to see things from their perspective and address their needs and their concerns in a way that is comfortable. But also you need to think about what sort of people you should have at your startup.
For me, Yaniv, this is a problem of recruiting. And it's a problem of an immature ecosystem. I don't think anybody over here in Silicon Valley would say to their founder, hey, what's my professional development trajectory at this company when they look around and there's 3 people? It's understood that the first number of employees are really pseudo co-founders, right? They should have some amount of equity that is not insignificant. They should have a lot of buy-in that is really significant. And they should understand that the growth of this startup is their career professional development. That as the startup grows, that contributes to their wealth, contributes to their experience, contributes to their resume, and contributes to their leadership experience as they build an org below them. This is not to say, Yaniv, that the topic is wrong or that founders are not going to bump into this. It's to say, I think this is partly a symptom of an immature ecosystem where you're recruiting from pools of agencies and big co's, and partly that because of that limited pool, you may be hiring the wrong kind of people potentially. But it's something that you have to manage in that environment. So I think this episode will be very important for that.
Yeah, look, I think you're partly right. And, I wanted to dive into that a bit more. But yes, I think there's an ecosystem thing. I do believe a couple of things, right? One is that even if you get hiring right, you will still run into this more than you want. Even if you're in a mature ecosystem, you will end up with people like this. And two, you kind of do owe people a certain amount, right? And so what I wanted to talk about here is how do you head some of this stuff off at the pass? How do you say, okay, I want my people to feel looked after, right? Because, what you said is true, but it can also come across as a bit obnoxious. And what I mean by that is I'm a founder, right? Let's say I've got a co-founder. So we've got 40% equity each in the company because we're founders. And then you hire someone and you're like, here's 0.15% equity in the company. And then you say, we're all owners, right? You're all owners and you shouldn't focus on your salary or your career growth. We're all here to make a big success. And if we do, we'll make lots of money. And I might be like, yeah, but if we have a big exit, you're making 250 times more money than I am. So it's not the same. And that's what I mean about having empathy for your employees.
But that equity breakdown is wrong at the outset. You need to think about your first employees as sort of investors in your company. They're entering at a stage of the company that is higher risk than if they went to a more mature startup or a more mature company. And so they need a commensurate amount of equity to compensate for that risk. You should be hiring people who deserve and worthy of a meaningful piece of the company, and they should get a meaningful percent of the company, meaning 1 or 2 or 3% over a 4-year vesting schedule.
I would say that is extremely rare. Options pools tend to be 10 to 15% of total equity. They are meant to last for years. Founders will tend to focus on giving those bigger chunks to executive hires. But I'm talking about let's say you're hiring a customer support agent or a product manager or whatever, right? A non-exec hire, you will find that their equity percentage is well under 1%. And I think that's just a reality on the ground.
Yeah, okay. A customer service rep, I'm talking more about a lead engineer. I'm talking about a lead marketer, yeah.
I'm talking about everybody here, right? Because the problem is anybody at your company, if any of them start making these noises, then it's your problem.
Right.
So not everyone at the company is going to have 1+% equity. In fact, a lot of people are not going to have that. And, that's one of the things.
By the way, I love this because I'm the audience surrogate here because you're rolling out the topic to me as we go. So yeah. I'm like, I don't know, Yaniv, I don't know if I agree with that. So we're dealing with these objections as we go. No, you're right. So if they're a lower tier hired customer support agent or an ops agent, then certainly they're going to have a very, very small percentage of equity, if any. And certainly they're going to be looking around wondering, hey, how do I make sure I get mine covered?
Exactly. So why is this a problem when people are saying, how do I progress? I want a bigger title. When's the next salary cycle and so on? Is because as a founder, it's not that you don't care about people and helping them achieve their career goals, is you do not have the bandwidth for that. If you take more than the minimum amount of time to focus on these internal things, that is taking your attention away from the one thing that really matters, which is making the startup succeed, right? You do not want to be shuffling the deck chairs, not on the Titanic because you're in a freaking lifeboat. You don't want to shuffle the deck chairs on your lifeboat. You want to survive. And that's where your attention needs to be. So this is not about selfishness. You literally don't have time for that in your role as a founder and as a CEO. So what are the right profile for somebody at an early stage startup? The first thing I would say, Chris, is you want to hire people who register high on intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. What does that mean? It means that they get their energy and their satisfaction from being able to do great work and from the actual learning they do, not from the increase in their job title or whatever, but from the fact that every day they're at the startup, they're getting new knowledge that they can bank away, right? So they don't need a lot of praise. They don't need promotions. They don't need all of this thing. They're like, I'm doing great work. I'm learning. I know I'm doing great work. That is what matters to me.
How this looks in an interview question, for example, is, why are you interested in this company or why are you interested in leaving your other company? And the answer needs to be, I've stopped learning. I want to learn. I want to grow. I want to challenge myself. I want to do something that's fundamentally new and different. That's what you want to hear from an upstart who has this intrinsic motivation versus extrinsic things, right? If they say, oh, I feel like I'm stuck at my job title, I'm stuck at my rung, there's no room for advancement, all this kind of stuff, that's the wrong reason to hire someone for your very, very early stage startup. The cliche answer out here in Silicon Valley is, I want to learn. I want to learn and I want to grow. That's like almost the only answer you will hear in a job interview.
Exactly right. And so then the next thing is you want people who are comfortable navigating through unstructured environments, right? So you're not going to have like this super good career ladder and like learning and professional development programs and well-defined job titles and all of that. Instead, you've got a bunch of people doing their best to try to make it work. And you need to be okay with that. And a lot of people, this is not uncorrelated with the extrinsic motivation thing, but it is somewhat separate, right? People need to be like, nothing here totally works. People are not telling me what to do or telling me how to learn. So that's another thing, right? You talk, Chris, about in Silicon Valley, people say, I want to learn. Great. You're going to be in an environment that is full of material from which you can learn, but no one's going to be spoon feeding it to you. You're going to have to figure out yourself how to learn this. It's an unstructured curriculum. And so it's really important that you don't have people who are like, oh, okay, like I need a 4-week onboarding. Like it starts even with onboarding, right? When someone joins the company, if you join a well-run big company, you have a structured program. And when you join a startup, it's like, here's your computer and like you get invited to a bunch of meetings and, if you're lucky, you get a mentor assigned to you. But that's it. So yes, great learning environment, but only if you thrive in an unstructured learning environment.
Yeah. So again, the trick here in an interview process is to ask them, why are you leaving your big co, right? At Uber, we used to ask people, why are you leaving Facebook or Google or Amazon? And if the answer wasn't some version of, it was a bureaucratic nightmare over there and I want to have more hustle and I want to have more independence and I want to feel like I'm critical to the process, then they were an instant fail because we knew that they were institutionalized at Google and Facebook and Amazon. And they were used to having all the resources and all of the bureaucracy and all of the scaffolding. And we wanted, people who knew how to hustle and how to get shit done. And so that's what you need to be looking for. When you ask them, why are you leaving your big company and why are you talking to a startup? They need to talk about a hunger to make an impact, to do great things, and to get out of bureaucracies. That's what you need to be listening for.
And then the next thing then is also you want people who are not too hierarchical. And maybe I'll even add to that, non-hierarchical and non-competitive. What do I mean by that? You want people who are focused on their own work, on the job in front of them, on the mission of the company, not on their position relative to other people in the company, right? You don't want to be like, I've got more experience than this person in my previous role, so I should have a better title than them, or I should be paid more than them, or I should have some sort of influence over them. You see this quite often where people come in and they don't leave their previous roles at the door. They expect a certain position. And again, all these things relate, Chris. Like it's somewhat related to extrinsic motivation, right? It might come through in terms of title. You might say, hey, I'm software engineer. I've got 10 years of experience as an engineer. Joe Bloggs next to me has 2 years, and they're also called software engineer. I should be called senior software engineer. These are conversations I've had. This is not made up.
Yeah, I've had conversations in a scale-up where somebody wanted to switch from a very, very different role over to product. And they were quibbling about the fact that they didn't get senior product manager in their title. Like, well, I'm very senior and I've been with this company for a long time and I know all the problems. I should therefore be a senior product manager. I'm like, dude, you've never done product. You don't know how to write a PRD. You are setting yourself up for failure and you're focused on the wrong thing. This is an opportunity for you to cross over into product, to learn the ropes, to learn from your peers. You are at best a product manager, probably an associate product manager. Take it and learn.
Yeah, but also you shouldn't care. I think this is more my point, right? Which is like at a big company, you need to have your product manager and your senior product manager and your staff product manager and your group product manager. And it's like at a startup, you're all just product managers. Well, there's probably only 1 or 2 anyway, or like whatever. But you don't want to quibble over titles because what you're doing there is just creating organizational debt, organizational load for the founder who then needs to figure out, like, if you're senior, well, the other person also expects to be senior. And then, what the implications flow through. And you just don't have time for that. Again, you're on a leaky life raft. You've got to be rowing. You don't want to decide like who's the chief oar handler for, just fucking get on with it, right? This is hard to unlearn because as humans, we are hierarchical creatures. And also, if you come from big corp, titles and seniority and hierarchy is like a huge part of how the game is played. So it's natural to sort of default to that. But it's really important that it doesn't overwhelm the job that actually needs to be done. It's a waste of time.
There's a famous quote from Sheryl Sandberg who said, if you're offered a seat on a rocket ship, you don't stop to ask which one. And, this is part of the point, which is if they're truly believing in the startup, both in terms of a culture of a startup, but specifically your startup, then you want to be looking for a signal that the title is irrelevant, the seat is irrelevant. It's how do I get in and help you? How do I get part of this community, part of this effort, part of this thing that I believe will be a rocket ship? And so if they're sitting there sort of like quibbling about titles and, in the interview process, like, what will my title be? And what are your leveling like? And I'm like, oh my God, please leave now. Kick them out of your office.
I mostly agree with that statement. I do feel it can be easily misinterpreted in a similar way to what I said before, which is I don't want any of this to be interpreted as you should not care about the needs of your team, that they should be so grateful to be on the freaking rocket ship that they can just sort of take abuse and neglect and underpayment and unfairness and all of that. That's not what we're saying here, right? What we're saying is if you are focused on status, on extrinsic motivation, on title, more than on having impact, then this is not the right place for you. You shouldn't care if you're called engineer or senior engineer. If you're a more senior engineer, you will probably be paid more and you will probably get more complex, more impactful work to do. The title doesn't matter. So why are you focusing on it?
Yeah, absolutely. There's no justification for abuse or for not attending to the needs of your team. But as you said, Yaniv, you want to build a team that is interested and concerned with the right things for your stage of company. And so their needs, their concerns should be how to make this rowboat into a speedboat. That's what their needs and concerns should be for the most part. Yeah. There's fine lines everywhere here, and it's not about treating them badly. And it's not about ignoring this for too long either, right? So one of the mistakes Uber made is to underinvest in a HR function and to underinvest in these things long past when it was due. But early stage, 3, 4, 5, 7 people, and you're trying to turn a leaky bucket into a speedboat.
Even 10, 15, 20. Yeah.
Absolutely. There's no time to stop and ask which seat are you on.
So there's two other things I wanted to mention about like the profile for someone. So the first is, put it this way, I would want to be aware of cultural factors that come into this. We've talked about extrinsic motivation. We've talked about hierarchy and structure and, factors like power distance and whatnot that are characteristics of national or ethnic cultures matter here. So my last startup, Circular, was partly based in Singapore. And Singapore is a fairly hierarchical culture. It has a strong Chinese influence and Malay. And it's quite hierarchical. And so traditional Singaporean companies are quite hierarchical. And so people's assumptions coming into the startup will be a bit different. And so first of all, that makes it even more important to choose people who perhaps, their personal characteristics are less aligned with that, right? They're like, okay, I'm in a hierarchical culture, but I've never enjoyed being part of that culture. I want to be more meritocratic or more intrinsically motivated. I always struggled at my big Singaporean bank because it was so hierarchical. So you want to look for the rebels a little bit, right? But also you want to be more explicit in teaching people the differences between maybe the cultural assumptions that they were brought up with, that they were surrounded by, and how this company needs to operate. Because otherwise, they're just not going to realize that misalignment, right? It's not their job to know. It's your job to educate them. So if you come from some cultures, US or, a lot of Anglo cultures that are relatively unhierarchical, relatively low power distance, you will find people are more naturally attuned to this. Whereas if you go to more an Asian culture or a South American culture, they might be less attuned to it, right? And so it's just worth being aware of these things, especially these days. You have people from all over the world. You have a lot of offshore hiring. And so if you're not aware of cultural dynamics, they're likely to come and bite you in this domain.
I would argue this is one of the most fundamental problems in startups outside of Silicon Valley, period. And really, this whole section of the pod is really about hiring well. And, we've had other episodes also about hiring well and how to interview and how to look for great candidates. There is this thing that is said so often that it's become cliche. People gloss over it, roll their eyes, don't think about it too much. But it really is all about your team. It's all about your team. It's all about the people. This can't be overstated. And, there's another axiom, which is also a cliche because it's true, is hire slow, fire fast, because it's all about the people. And I have made this mistake over and over and over again. I hire too quickly. I hire from offshore. I tolerate people's mediocrity for way too long because I'm a nice guy and I think they can do it and I can coach them into it. It is a disaster. I've explained this before on the podcast, but I'll explain it again. I have seen teams take 3, 6, 8 months to do something that I have seen other teams do in 6 days. And the team that did it in 6 days did it better. I've seen this over and over and over again. I know it's just the first section of this episode, and we have a whole episode about hiring well, but this cannot be overstated. Please, please, please curate and prune your team proactively, because this is just the first step to success on every dimension, not just this one that we're talking about today.
I just wanted to quickly touch on one other factor that is important in terms of a person's profile for an early stage startup, and that is a willingness to unlearn. It can be hard to interview for this, but it's really important because, again, when you come into a startup, especially your first startup, you're going to have a bunch of assumptions about hierarchy, about how people work together, about how things get done. And most of those are not going to serve you in the startup, especially if you come from big corp or if you come from academia or whatever, right? Straight from school even. They're not going to serve you. So you need to be willing to open your eyes and look around you. And in order to learn how to do things, first you need to be able to discard your own assumptions. So you need to have that mental agility to be able to unlearn. And you really want people who are like that, who don't have their identity too closely tied to what they think they know, so that they can adapt to your startup way of doing things. So that's everything that you need to know in terms of thinking about the sort of profile of person you want at your startup and how that applies to hiring. But now let's talk about, you have these people in there, and like I said, this is not an excuse to neglect them. So there's this big tech term, professional development, right? A big company term. What does it mean? What does it mean to develop professionally at a startup? And what as a founder can you do for people? What is reasonable and appropriate to help people develop professionally at the early stage? First of all, I would say nothing formal. Again, we talked about unlearning. Whatever you thought professional development was, whether it's courses and programs and lunchtime thingies and certifications and God knows what, none of that. That is a waste of time for everybody at an early stage startup. You will have opportunities to develop as a professional, but do not expect as an employee and do not provide as a founder a structured professional development program, because that is just all kinds of wrong for the stage that you're at. So first of all, discard that.
Yeah, who has time for this crap, right? A startup is a learning machine, and the company itself is learning at a rate of knots, and the people in the company should be learning and growing at a rate of knots, right? And so what is their professional development program? Being part of a startup. It is the hardest, most interesting, most compelling, most exciting thing you can do in business, I believe. How are you going to help me with my professional development? Being part of this startup. Congratulations, Harry. Welcome aboard.
Yes, right? So you're 90% of the way there, right? But what you want to make sure of is that the environment in the startup, especially, if you're a less senior employee, is conducive to learning. You don't want a culture where people are effectively kept in the dark and just sort of, they call this management style mushroom farming, right? Which is like, you keep them in the dark and feed them bullshit. It's like, no, you want people to be empowered to do their jobs and empowered to learn. And what does that mean? It means that it makes sense to provide employees with mentoring. Again, not a formal mentorship program, but informal mentoring. You want to make sure that you provide them some of that scaffolding that helps them learn, helps them make sense of all the chaos around them, right? And that is being mentored with someone, one of the founders, a more senior member of the team or whatnot. And more broadly, and we've had whole episodes around alignment and transparency and so on, they can only learn effectively from the startup if they have good exposure to how the business actually works. So we'll come back to exactly what that looks like. But professional development means, again, it's unstructured, but you have all of this stuff, all of this context, all of this information just sitting there like this smorgasbord of learning opportunities that on the job you will pick up. And I think, it's really important in a startup that everyone has that exposure.
Yeah, so I guess this is a good opportunity to talk about the kind of mentoring and coaching that I do and that you do. So there's no time to go send them off on some professional development course. It's about learning on the job. Now, not all startups have access to AAA talent where you bring in the world-class growth leader of whatever or the world-class product leader of whatever. You want to bring in scrappy, ambitious, hungry people from around you, but they may not be mature and senior enough to do what you need them to do. And so mentoring them with a strategic advisor, with a coach, with a mentor that can partner with them while they work to teach by doing, teach by demonstration, teach by executing the needs of the startup, that certainly makes a hell of a lot of sense. And that just levels up the whole company. So that makes sense. But yeah, not these heavy duty, formal, external training programs.
Right. And yes, and to be a bit tactical about that, I think, if you've got a little bit of money to put into this as a founder or as a company, What I would say is if you have people on your team and they want to pay to do certain online courses that help them directly with their job, membership-based communities, right? It's like I'm a growth marketer and there's this great paid community for growth marketers and so on. In terms of helping them develop as professionals in a way that is completely aligned with just getting shit done as part of the startup, I would be inclined to pay for that sort of thing. But then if you go to like in-person conferences and courses and things like that, that are, first of all, usually more expensive. Second of all, much more taking you out of your context and just sort of dumping you in a different environment for a few days. I don't think that's valuable. I think it's a waste of time and money. I think, if you've got a little bit of money set aside for professional development and you don't want it to be just this sort of bullshit thing, but actually something that helps people grow and learn, I would focus on these things like, online courses, membership communities, sort of cohort and peer-based things, or coaching, to your point, things that can fit into how they do their job and support them in their learning on the job, I guess, rather than something that's like a separate learning environment, is what I would say.
Also, conferences and meetups and all this stuff is a mixed bag. There are some really high quality conferences and meetups you can go to where it's valuable to network, it's valuable to learn, especially if you're in a sales role or developer advocacy role. This is the way you build the network and build buzz and awareness. If you're a CEO, there are certain conferences you got to be at.
Oh, that's different though. Just to be clear, Chris, that's different because these are not for the purpose of learning. You say, we care about your growth as a professional, so we'll send you to conferences. No.
Right.
You go to conferences for the needs of the business, and that's what you're talking about.
Right. And so you do not want people who are taking chunks out of their day to go attend conference after conference, meetup after meetup. Now, if they're enmeshed in the community as part of their personal time and they're showing an enthusiasm for the domain or the startups in general, that's great. Yeah, you don't want people to go to the opening of a chip packet, as my friend Ben Metcalf will say. Be careful about curating that stuff and wasting too much time with it.
Just my final word on professional development, and this harks back to our previous point, Chris, about like what's the right profile. If people cannot figure out for themselves how they can grow at a startup, at your startup, then that's a red flag, right? It is not your job in an early stage startup to hold people's hands, to spoon feed them growth. You are there. You are 100% focused on building a business, a startup that can succeed. Within that context, you should provide an environment that is rich in learning opportunities. But then it is the job of each individual within the organization to take advantage of those learning opportunities in order to become more effective and more impactful in their role. That is not your job. And so if they insist that it is your job, they're like, hey, how are you helping me grow? Then that is actually a bit of a red flag. And that's a sign probably either that you've made a hiring mistake or more generously that you have failed to educate people on what is a reasonable expectation or a reasonable modality for growth and professional growth at a startup.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say as well, which is if after all of this stuff that we've just discussed, which is giving access to the mechanisms of the business, giving people visibility, helping them with mentoring, and they're still saying, yeah, but how are you helping me grow? Then you've made a hiring mistake. And so it's, back to section 1 of this podcast. You made a mistake. People make mistakes. That's okay. Fire fast. Hire slow, fire fast, move on. There's no time. And because that bad culture will infect other people in your company. It's worse than they're not doing their job. They're demoralizing the other people who are doing their job. And so that's why fire fast is also critical at these precious early stages.
Over 7,000 global companies like Atlassian, Dovetail, Flow Health, and Quora all use Vanta to manage risk and prove security in real time. Why aren't you? Get $1,000 off Vanta when you go to vanta.com/TSP. That's VANTA.com/TSP for the Startup Podcast to get $1,000 off. Okay, so that sort of like overall, what does professional development, that aspect of growth, the learning look like at the early stage? Now, there's another one that is harder to get around, and that is compensation. I think it is the case, unless you've managed to raise some mega round very early, some AI startup founded by a multi-time founder and whatnot, is that compensation is extremely painful at the early stages. And there's 2 reasons for that. One is you don't have much money. You're trying to maximize your runway. The second is doing compensation well and fairly is in itself a massive resource drain, right? If you want to compensate people, it's not just about giving them a good salary. It's about having a process that seems fair and that everybody is sort of comfortable with and so on. And it can become a huge drain, right? And so in particular, again, when you look at how most larger companies work, is they have some sort of annual compensation review cycle and whatnot. And you're like, okay, people expect that. Maybe we should do some annual comp review. Annual comp reviews at any stage of any company are a huge drain on resources. So the difference with a startup is that is a drain on resources you cannot afford. And this is me from my own experience, having gone through this pain. Doing comp planning well is really, really hard, really, really time consuming. And especially when you have a limited budget, which you always do, but particularly at a startup, it is even harder and more painful because you cannot simply throw money at the problem. So here's my maybe very slightly unorthodox or contrarian take on what I would do next time. So this is not necessarily the only standard practice, but this is what I would do. I would make it clear at hiring time. When I hire someone, I would negotiate fairly. I wouldn't say to them, okay, this is all we can afford to pay. Review your salary real soon, because I've seen that become an albatross around founders' necks as well. They make promises, then they forget, then the employee resents it and asks for even more money or leaves. So negotiate fairly. Be generous with equity in particular, right? So you don't have much cash, but in a sense, you have more equity per employee than a later stage company. That is your secret weapon. We sort of touched on it earlier, Chris. It's like the equity that you offer early employees should be meaningful. You shouldn't be stingy with that. But also be fair on cash. Don't try to get a bargain. Why? Because this is the unorthodox part of my prescription, is set an expectation that it will be quite a while until salaries are reviewed. I think a lot of headaches can be saved and would have been saved by me and my startups if I said, look, you're an early stage employee. This is the salary we're paying you now. And that's probably it for the next 3 years. Like, you have to be comfortable that this is what you're going to be earning for the next 3 years, because we don't have the time or resource visiting this. And I don't want it to be a point of tension or discomfort or any other sort of resentment over the next few years, because we have a job to do. And any of that is going to distract from doing that job.
There tends to be this kind of assumption that startups pay below market rate and compensate a little bit with equity. I would say that's generally true, but market rate has to be calibrated to the caliber of the person you're hiring. And as I've been saying throughout this episode, you want to hire great people who are really calibrated to startup life. And to the degree that you can find rock stars, you need to compensate them well. Ideally, they're not in it just for the money. They're in it for the equity. They're in it for the rocket ship. They're in it for all that sort of stuff. But their expectations are higher. They're harder to get. And their value can be not just a little bit more, but 10 or 20 or 100x more. And opportunity cost is the highest cost in a startup. And so, yes, compensate them well. You said generously, Yaniv. Yes, generously, commensurate with the value and experience they bring to the table. That's really, really important. And I've seen a lot of founders, boards, advisors who are talking about like, wow, that's expensive, or they're expensive. And one of the favorite things one of my VC friends said to a founder that he introduced me to is, Chris is expensive, but it's more expensive to not get him. And that's the spirit in which you have to think about it is it more expensive to lose the candidate or to not have the candidate in your team than to screw around with dollars and cents when you're trying to fast forward to the future?
I agree with that, but I'm going a little bit further than that. One thing that is really easy temptation to fall for, I've seen founders do it, is to say, look, we can't afford to pay you your market rate now. We will pay you less. But as soon as we raise our seed round, or as soon as we raise our Series A, we'll review your salary. Okay, so again, you have just organizational debt, because you as a founder might forget that promise, but I will tell you who will not forget that promise ever is that employee. They will remember that promise. And more than that, they will probably inflate it in their mind so that by the time you get to that next raise, they're expecting a big fucking salary increase that you're probably not going to satisfy them with. And basically, what I'm suggesting here is that's not worth it. Pay full freight from the beginning, even if that feels painful, and make it very clear that you don't want to discuss salary with them for quite a long time after that, because these salary discussions can become a real drain. Like, I cannot overemphasize this. It causes a lot of churn. It can also cause quite a lot of bad feeling. Nobody enjoys talking about money. And generally what happens is you have the discussions, people leave a bit unhappy, the resentment builds up, then it kind of comes out later. It's not worth it. Pay people generously and set an expectation that we're not revisiting this for the foreseeable future, and you will save yourself so much of this pain. And even if you lose one or two great hires because they're like, I'm not comfortable with that, well, that means that you couldn't afford them, right? That's the compensation thing. Really hard. It can be a bit glib of us, Chris. It can sort of sound like, well, it's easy for you to say you should pay them a full amount, but I just don't have a lot of money. And I was like, yes, but you have to discuss what you can afford. But if you can't afford to hire someone at that level, then you can't afford them, right? Underpaying them is not a solution. Now, I want to talk about performance management. So, this is the other sort of side of career stuff at larger companies. HR is responsible for. It can be quite bureaucratic, and it's all about legal considerations and employment law and so on. At an early stage startup, I would say that is really dangerous. And, it's related to what you said, Chris: hire slow, fire fast. So what does performance management look like? We're not going to have annual performance reviews, and we're not going to have a lot of really formal processes, but performance management is important. It's just different. And this is the way I would approach it. First of all, regular, timely feedback is the most important thing. That is always true. Even more important at an early stage startup, because first of all, you're not going to have the formal processes to back you up. You're not going to have HR. You're not going to have all of this. It is your job as a founder, as a de facto, as the manager of everybody at the beginning, especially at the early stages. People need to know where they stand. If they are doing well, they should know how they're doing well. If they're not doing well, they should know how they're not doing well. And they should know that if that doesn't change, then their role, or their job rather, might be in jeopardy. We had the episode not that long ago, Chris, with Paddy McCord, which was brilliant. So performance improvement plans, PIPs as they're often called, are hardly ever a good idea.
Sometimes it's called radical candor, right? Or just basic forthrightness, being honest and clear about how you feel someone is doing, especially someone that directly reports to you, and having hard conversations. Again, cultures with big power distances, cultures that are very egalitarian, and just people's psychology in general will always dissuade or diminish people's enthusiasm for these kinds of conversations, right? But they're critical. They're critical to great leadership. If you want to be a great founder, you have to have difficult conversations with all stakeholders at all times. You need to be diplomatic, you need to be thoughtful, but you need to be forthright. A good test for this is, if you were to fire that person, would they be surprised?
Yeah.
Would they be surprised because you've already had a forthright conversation with them? It's not just about early stage startups. This is true about leadership at all levels, at all stages of companies.
That's a good segue, Chris, because we had Paddy McCord on the podcast not that long ago from Netflix, and she talked about the dreaded performance improvement plan and how badly it's overused, right? And the performance improvement plan is this process where you say, oh, okay, your job's in jeopardy, you're underperforming, we're putting you on this plan, and if you don't pass the plan, then at the end of it, we fire you. Now, this is overused at big companies. It's often used as an excuse not to give that feedback, but at a small early stage startup, it is hardly ever a good idea. I cannot think of a time where at an early stage startup, you should be putting someone on a performance improvement plan. And so to your point, Chris, the only way to make this fair is that the point at which you let them go shouldn't be the first time that they know that they're not performing well. So you need to have that regular cadence of feedback and radical candor and whatnot. And when it's clear that it's not going to work out, you should let them go. I do have a quick aside here on employment law. There are places like many states in the US that have at-will employment where you can do this without any legal risk. In many other jurisdictions and countries, including in Australia, you have more worker protections, and that means that letting somebody go without going through a formal process is legally risky, technically. My experience, and your mileage may vary, is that, again, if you look at the list of existential risks for your startup, the risk of successfully being sued for unfair dismissal or for whatever breach of employment law it's called in your country is much lower than the risk of failing because you have tolerated poor performance or mediocre performance for too long. While, it's probably good to get some legal advice and say, like, how can I do this in a way that minimizes my legal exposure? You do not want to be hanging around going through like massive bureaucracy and having a person hang around on the payroll, but more importantly, simply not able to do their job to the standard that's required, simply to meet certain legal obligations. And again, I want to draw a clear distinction, Chris, between legal and ethical or moral obligations. You should always treat people with respect. You should make sure that as much as possible that they're looked after financially and all of these things, right? But these employment laws are not a good fit for the fast pace of change and the high degree of risk in a startup. And so I think you simply need to acknowledge that and make sure that your focus is on doing what's right for the company rather than on following the letter of the law.
Yeah, that's right. This is another great example of a bureaucracy that you don't have time for. And so, with all the caveats, we are not lawyers, we're not HR experts, and we're not giving you legal advice here, but talk to the experts and find a way to cut them from your company as fast as possible. And as you also said, Yaniv, that does not mean to be brutal, to be rude, to be unnecessarily punitive. It just means you need to make sure your company is well pruned and executing well. And so don't get overwrought and overcaught in this legal mess. And you remember that these lawyers are there to tell you about risk. That's their job. You need to understand how that risk compares to other forms of risk. And at a very early stage company, the other forms of risk like opportunity cost and cost of disruption and cost to culture is typically higher than a well-informed employee who has been given clear notice about their performance, who is told to go somewhere else. You know, the risk of them coming and actually making a material claim against your company is pretty minute.
Well, Patty actually said on our podcast, she said, people don't sue companies because they were let go. People sue because they're pissed off, because they haven't been treated with respect. They haven't been given the feedback. So the way to reduce your legal risk is to not piss people off when you do it. And that's as much about how you do it as what you do it. But also just a very tactical bit of prompt engineering advice when you do involve a lawyer here is don't say, I need to let go of this person. How should I do it? Because again, then they will try to minimize risk and give you all of this process. You should say, I'm letting go of this person at the end of the week. How can I do it in a way that minimizes the risk within that context? Lawyers are there to help you, right? Lawyers are great. I'm not here to diss lawyers. It's just that by default, if you don't give them more specific overriding instructions, they will give you the least risky advice. And that's not what you want in this case, because that's not the risk that you should really be caring about.
Beautiful point there, Yaniv. And I love that you called it prompt engineering. Asking the right questions. We should do a whole episode about asking the right questions. Just as a really fun aside that's apropos of nothing, one of my favorite movies is The Labyrinth with David Bowie and Jennifer Connelly.
I wasn't expecting that.
Yeah, that movie is all about teaching kids to ask the right question. The entire theme, if you notice, at every stage along the way, if she had asked the right question, she would have gotten to the center of the castle more quickly. It is such a beautiful art to ask the right questions of your vendors and of your ChatGPT and of your customers and clients and team. Wow, that is such a superpower. And yeah, that's a really good call out that you just said there about lawyers. Very true. Very true.
Thanks, brother. All right. One other thing I wanted to talk about in the context of performance management, and this is cultural pre-work that you can do to make it smoother when it happens, right? And that is to socialize the idea within your startup to all employees that roles evolve, and someone who is great at one stage may simply no longer be the right fit for the role later on, right? So performance is always relative to something, right? There's that saying, if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it'll spend its whole life thinking it's a failure, right? So the problem here is in a startup, you might start off in the ocean and then suddenly your job goes from swimming around to climbing a tree. You're no longer a good fit for that. And so you might have been an excellent performer who has turned into an underperformer, and that's not a personal judgment on you. It's not a judgment on the company. It is simply that there's been a divergence between what you are good at and what you have that natural affinity for and what is required of the job. And so if you make that clear, it makes this whole thing less personal, less problematic to say, you know, this person has done what was needed of them at the startup, and now it's time to say goodbye. And if people understand that that is what happens and that it's not a personal judgment, and that people, when that time comes, that they are well looked after, again, to that point, you don't want to be penny pinching when you let someone go. You have limited cash, but you also don't want to be penny pinching. Then that turns down the heat on all of this and it frames the conversations in a different way. And look, this is good advice anyway for how to manage performance. And I think we went through some of this with Patty. But again, at an early stage startup, things are changing so fast. Roles become redundant, or people and the roles simply diverge in what's needed of them. The team that you have at the beginning is not going to be the right team later on. And that's not anyone's fault. And that's okay. As long as everybody gains from being a part of it, then that is okay. And if you communicate that clearly, it will really help whenever you have these conversations.
Yeah, you know, this connects all the way back to the first part of the episode. A word we didn't use and we should have used is fit. It's about fit. So traditionally, when you go for a big code job, it's kind of like this anxious thing of like, will they hire me? You're trying to prove yourself to the company. Again, more sophisticated, more senior operators in more sophisticated markets, and especially at startup life, the question is less about, will they hire me? And more, are you a fit for each other? And so you as an employee should be vetting the company just as much as they're vetting you and looking for fit, for cultural fit, for talent fit. And there is fit drift, as you alluded to, Yaniv, right? Where the role evolves, the needs of the company changes.
I like that term.
Yeah, and so if there's a fit drift and the delta becomes too large and the employee is unable to catch up, keep up, or close that delta, then there's no longer a fit, and that's okay. and there's a fit mismatch, and they're needed urgently elsewhere.
You've grown apart.
Yes. It's not you, it's me.
Oh, yeah, but it's a funny joke, but sometimes it's just true. People diverge,
Yeah.
companies and people diverge. So that's really sort of how I think about like performance management and, particularly letting people go when necessary during a startup. So the final topic I wanted to cover, which is in a sense a little bit of a catch-all or a summary of some of the things we've talked about before, is how do you keep people motivated if you cannot offer them regular salary reviews, regular title reviews, structured professional development, all of these things? How do you keep them motivated and excited about working at your startup? So, number one, invest in culture. Make your startup a place where people can do their best work. Again, hopefully you followed some of our advice and like, what is the good fit? How do you hire someone who's a good fit for startup? They're intrinsically motivated. That's one of the things we talked about, right? If you're intrinsically motivated, what you are going to want out of your startup role is a place where you can do your best work, where you can learn, where you feel a part of something, right? So make your startup that place. That's the thing you can give for free. A big company actually has a lot more trouble providing, right? Is that freedom and that sense of purpose and that sense of being able to fully do your best in your role. So if you miss the opportunity to create a culture where that is the case, then you're missing the biggest advantage as an employer that your startup has over big co's. So do not skimp on this. The next one I wanted to talk about is maximum transparency. And again, that's sort of implied from what we were talking about later, where we say we want to make sure the rich learning environment that is a startup, you maximize the ability of that being a rich learning environment for every employee. So that means that the strategy discussions, the financial position, your runway, your burn, that shouldn't be restricted just to the founding group or whatever. Everyone should know what is happening at the startup so they can learn. And that is both going to help them in their professional development, as well as help them do their best job as employees of your startup. Related to that, give people stretch opportunities, right? So the best way to help people grow at a startup is to give them some piece of work to do that they probably wouldn't have been given the opportunity to do if they were at a big company at their stage in their career, and give them the opportunity, first of all, to do that work and to take that ownership and prove what they're capable of, but also a bit of room to fail. So, if you give people a stretch opportunity and they're not quite up to it, you can't just turn around and fire them for that, right? There needs to be that room to stretch and to fail and to maximize your growth and learning in that way. All of these are things you can do for free that will actually help your startup in its actual business objectives, as well as providing people a better career growth experience. So it's all really valuable. And the final one I wanted to mention, again, coming back, is be generous with equity, but that's one part of it. The other thing that I see so many startups absolutely fail at is storytelling around equity, right? Again, don't assume that your employees, especially your less senior employees, understand equity that well. So a lot of people will kind of mark their equity to zero. Like if you're offering them a salary of $80,000 and 1% of the company, they will interpret that as a salary of $80,000. They will discount their equity to zero. You need to tell them how equity works, paint a picture of what their total compensation will look like if the company achieves this goal, that goal, reaches this valuation, that valuation, get them excited about it, get them to assign value to that equity as part of their overall compensation package. Otherwise, you're missing a trick, and you're certainly missing an opportunity to get people excited about the growth of the company. Because being intrinsically motivated, just to be clear, doesn't mean that people don't care about money. Most people care about money more than they will admit. There's a status piece, there's a like being paid your worth piece. That matters. Even if you're intrinsically motivated, that somewhat matters. But also, money pays the bills. And, you shouldn't pretend that's not the case. So people want to know that they're going to do well financially. There's nothing wrong with that. And so you need to tell people, hey, this equity, we can't promise it'll be worth anything, but it could be worth a lot. And furthermore, this is how to think about how to value your equity. Here's our guidance on how you should be thinking about your equity. And hopefully they'll do the maths and they'll be like, oh, I can make a lot of money out of this. That is exciting. I won't keep asking for salary increases that the company can't afford to give me and doesn't have the mental bandwidth to figure out what it should be, because I can see that if I help this business succeed, my equity will be worth a lot of money and I will feel good about that. When I'm hiring people, when I get to the offer stage and I say, this is how much cash and this is how much equity, I actually make a point of saying, this equity is a core part of your compensation package. It's not guaranteed, but I'm looking for people who see enough of the potential in this business that they think that the equity I'm offering them is valuable. If you zero out the equity in your mind, then I don't think this is the right place for you. You need to think that this equity is valuable because you think that you can help make this company valuable. This is not about drinking the Kool-Aid. This is about saying, I want people who are optimistic about the future of this company, that they can see the impact they can have. They can see the impact this company can have. If they don't see it, if they're like, you know what, I think this company is going to fail, I don't see I'm ever going to get any money out of my equity, and you don't want them there. And again, not in a way that is negative. You might have to pass on some great talent, people who would be great, who you like, who all sorts of things. If they can't see what it is that you're trying to build, they can't get excited about it. And their excitement about the equity is a proxy for their excitement about the company, then it's not a good fit. And you just need to accept that. So I actually give people that explicit, not an ultimatum as such, but I'm like, if you don't value this equity, then this is not the right place for you. And it's actually a really important discussion to have up front so that they can see the value of their total compensation.
Yeah, we should put a plug in here for Cake Equity, which is a company that's a friend of the pod. And
are they paying us?
Well, they're paying me with equity.
They're paying me.
Look, for me, Yaniv, I would summarize this like this, right? Nothing attracts and retains great startup talent more than great culture, A-plus players, a big vision, lots of momentum, and lots of ownership. In short, build a great company, build a great startup. That will attract and retain great talent. And if people don't stick around for that, then they're the wrong people in the first place. It's really about culture. Build something where they can stretch, they have room to fail, they have a lot of ownership, where they're surrounded by other A-plus players, people that they respect and admire. There's no people who are failing and then failing to get fired. That you have a big, ambitious vision that gets them motivated and excited, that they're focused on instead of their job titles and how many snacks are in the break room, and that they're feeling a sense of momentum, then they're feeling a sense of ownership over the upside. If you give them those 5 things and they're still not happy, they're the wrong people anyway, so get rid of them. That should give them all the career development, professional development, title bumps, and cash that they could possibly want, because they're startup talent, they're startup people. They have that in their DNA, and that's who you're looking for.
Awesome, mate.
All right, Yaniv, that's awesome. I think this is like a really pragmatic and practical guide to dealing with early stage employees and keeping them motivated and keeping them in the right headspace as it relates to professional development, compensation, titles, and so on. Thanks for walking us through this. I liked this episode. And unlike many of our other episodes, this was kind of one I co-discovered with the audience and got to react in real time. So I love it.
Now, if folks are looking for that overall guidance on how to build an effective startup, how to stay focused on what matters and not be diverted by things that look important but are not, I know that's something that you love to do with a handful of startups. So how can people approach you and see if they might want to work together?
Yeah, that's right, Yaniv. So I work with a small handful of companies at any given time to help them avoid these kinds of dead ends and wasted time and just fast forward to the best answers as quickly as possible. So feel free to learn more about that over at chrissaad.com/advisory or subscribe to my newsletter over at chrissaad.com/newsletter. How about you, Yaniv? How can people find you?
Well, I hang out on LinkedIn trying to make it a little bit less of a boring place. So please follow me or even send me a connection request. I love being connected with TSP listeners. So just let me know in your request. That's where you're coming from and I will accept it. All right, Chris, that was a fun one. Have a good one, mate.
All right, awesome. Tons of fun as always.
Today's episode of the Startup Podcast was brought to you by Vanta. Vanta automates compliance for SOC 2, ISO 27001, and more, saving you time and money while helping you build customer trust. Plus, you can streamline security reviews by automating questionnaires and demonstrating your security posture with a customer-facing trust center, all powered by Vanta AI. Over 7,000 global companies already use Vanta. Why don't you? Get $1,000 off Vanta when you go to vanta.com/TSP. That's VANTA.com/TSP for the Startup Podcast to get $1,000 off.